Ja, men nå det jo ikke så spredt.
Skal vi se, da sier jeg først, så står jeg her, og så sier jeg det gjennom dette. Så står du der kanskje mens jeg prater, og så bare går jeg til siden.
Og den trenger vi ikke da.
Jeg trenger den.
Sorry. Men husk at både NMBU og Holbergprisen medarrangører. Jeg var litt usikker om det. Her heter Holbergprisen support. Så han ikke fra der. Han fra... Så ja. Ja.
Så together.
Ja. Og da kan du si Holbergprisen foran der da, vet du.
Dette jo veldig strålende.
Nå det hvert fall liksom...
Hvis du står der. Hvor har vi vår laureate? Der, ja.
Ja, men skal vi vente?
Jeg tror vi bare begynner. Det ble en sånn naturlig stillhet. Vi bare begynner. Ja, det gjør vi. We are so pleased and honored to host this seminar with Joan Martinez-Alier, who is the Holbergpris laureate of 2023. I know you had a very busy schedule, and we are so pleased that you can spend this morning with us. You can see the audience is very highly qualified and extremely eager to discuss a lot of topics connected to your research. We are happy that the Holberg Committee supports this event together with the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and we also welcome Bjørn Ege Bertelsen, who represents the Holberg Committee. And welcome to all of you, of course. We are really looking forward to interesting presentations and comments. You can see today's program. No, you can't. You took it away, but maybe we can get it back sometime, just to remind you of today's program. This seminar will be recorded, so no secret questions or secret answers. And that is because we know that a lot of people would like to join us today, but are not able to be here in person. The seminar is initiated by senior researcher at Cicero, Marianne Aasen. So let me start by giving you the floor, Marianne.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristin. So once again, Joan, we're very grateful that you've accepted our invitation to participate in this seminar after a busy week of presenting and contributing to various discussions and dialogues about environmental justice with the perspective of the poor, including the circularity gap and power relations, perspectives often missing when we discuss environmental challenges in Norway. And I see people here. I'll take this away. Oh, no, too bad. So I see people here today from both academia, but also other fields, illustrating, I hope, the interest among both academic communities and decision makers in public and private entities and other in learning about the perspectives developed by ecological economists, in which you hold a very central and inspiring position, but also in discussing these perspectives and how to translate them into solutions or ways ahead. So we are therefore also very grateful to have you here, Kalle Mone, from the Department of Economics at the University of Oslo, to engage in these debates. You established the Center of Excellence for the Study of Equality, Social Organization and Performance, ESOP, and are engaged in and have contributed to research on relationships between institutions, distribution, conflict, corruption, and poverty, among many others. And you are an awarded science communicator and contributor to the public debate, often reminding us about perspectives of the poor, like you, Joan, both in and outside of Norway. So the discussion between you two, but hopefully with participation also from you other present, will be guided by Arild Vatn, who you've met before, Joan. Arild was the president of the European Society of Ecological Economists when Joan was president at the international level. And Arild is professor emeritus at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And among many on a long list of engagements, you were coordinating lead author of the value assessment of IPBES, the International Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So in the first part of this seminar, Joan's point of departure is Norway as part of the world, and therefore your title, The Relations Between Degrowth and Environmental Justice in Norway in the World. In the second part of this seminar, researchers from Cicero and the Norwegian University of Life Sciences will give presentations on topics related to the main challenges that we face. And you've asked us, Joan, to introduce the first session of this seminar with a very short summary of key environmental challenges that Norway face. And Kristin, in addition to your experience as a Minister of Finance, you have, among many other efforts for the environment, led and contributed to several committees on the transformation of the Norwegian economy away from fossil dependency. And today you are a member of the 2050 Climate Change Committee appointed by the Norwegian government, mandated to review Norway's choices for its pathway towards a low-emission society in 2050. And we agreed on 4 key points, and you can start.
Excuse me. I need this mic. Yeah, the first point is that since 1990, the Norwegian emissions has been reduced by 4%, and our target is 50 to 55 by 2030. So we really have to speed up. There are some changes when it comes to emissions. The emissions connected to extraction of oil and gas has increased, and emissions connected to industry has decreased.
Yes, and the second point is the land degradation and nature loss being a challenge due to road and building constructions at a high rate, among other activities. And we have committed to the global biodiversity framework and to protect 30% of ecosystems globally on land and on sea by 2030. So we have signed, but we have yet to make a plan on how to achieve the targets set in the agreement. Meeting these goals set in this agreement in combination with the climate targets is a huge challenge.
Yes, and third, Norway is an oil and gas producing country with large revenues from fossil fuels and a high standard of living and a very high standard of private consumption, resulting in high per capita energy consumption and extraction of materials on the world, leading on the world in this not very good news. We have to reduce our climate and nature footprint, that's for sure.
And then the last and fourth, the ecological modernization strategy of our climate policies relies heavily on technologies that require minerals mostly found outside of Europe, and that we are running short of due to the war in Ukraine. It also relies on land use, generating conflicts, such as in the case of the wind farms in Fosen, for example. So these are our 4 main points. Joan, and the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I come from a week in Bergen talking to the people in Bergen, or anybody was welcome in many of the occasions I had, including also one minister or two ministers, and then Prince Haakon, who came to give the prize. So now I am talking to specialists and to scientists, so I'll be careful intellectually, not politically, what I'm going to say. And I'm going to touch on all the 4 points that you mentioned, but not in the order that you mentioned. And first I want to start with this publicity, because this book, after the Holbergpris, now I have in front of me about 4 or 5 months correcting proofs and making the index, and with all the help from other people, of this book, which is coming out at the end of this year, November or December. And it's a big book. You cannot read the small letters, but it says this book will have 798 pages. I didn't know this until they sent this flyer, because more or less I knew that this might happen. So I'm very sorry. Fortunately, most of it will be electronic and not on paper. And well, and this is what I've been talking in Bergen and also here, and that's why I got the prize, because I'm working on this, on environmental justice movements, and I put this title, which I'm not going to discuss here, of land, water, air, and freedom, which is an improvement on the old slogan of land and freedom from peasant movements around the world, from Russia and Eastern Europe, Semblia y Volia, to Zapata in Mexico, Tierra y Libertad. So it's Tierra, Agua, Aire y Libertad, the title of the book, and the making of world movements of environmental justice. And what I want to do, because this is the plan was to talk about Norway, and which I don't know why I said yes, because I'm not a specialist in Norway, but here I am, and I'm going to base myself in the knowledge I have mainly from general knowledge, but also from our atlas of environmental injustices, which is reaching 4,000 cases, and on Norway there are about, I don't know how many, 8 or 10 examples of conflicts from the Alta River Dam conflict. And during this week I've been talking once to Judge Carsten Smith, and we talk about the sea Sami, and how not only the reindeer Sami and the other types of Sami, but also the sea Sami, and how this could be one conflict, the lack of good legislation about this to put in the others. So we are still increasing the number of cases in the others, and the others is the foundation for this book also, and other books, including 2 articles that came out this week, one in Science, not but with younger people in the team, and another one in Nature Sustainability by Arnim Scheidel and Senja Hanasik, who was in Bergen also, but she left this morning. So this, the others gives now is a consolidated database that allows to do comparative, statistical, political ecology, as I call it. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to try to explain something about Norway. When I had this short meeting with Prince Haakon, I found really he was informed. I asked him, have you read my speech? He said, no, I haven't read your speech. But he was briefed by somebody. So he asked some questions. What do you think of the growth? And then he said, what do you think of decoupling the economy from the social metabolism? And then he said, what do you think of the word, didn't say like this, but what do you think about externalities? And I said, really? I don't meet very often with royalty, but I don't know. There are many kings and queens in the world, and these are princes, and this seems to be a well-informed prince. And then, so I am going to talk externalities. I'm going to give a longer answer to this question, what do I think about externalities? And externalities, I think that as Carl Wilhelm Kapp, K-A-P-P, wrote in this book, The Social Cost of Business Enterprise, written or published in 1950 already, as a precursor very clearly of ecological economics, because he came from the tradition of Otto Neurath in Vienna and so on. And he, through exiles of Europeans in the 30s and then the 40s, and he ended his life as a professor in Switzerland, where he had written a thesis already in the 30s about international trade with a lot of information about, talking about environmental issues. Kapp, in this book of 1950, says, to summarize, externalities are not market failures, externalities are cost-shifting successes. He didn't write quite like this, but this is how I have summarized his views for many times already. Cost-shifting, and I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide, the excessive amount of carbon dioxide by the industrial economy, and therefore the greenhouse, or the increased greenhouse effect, isn't it? Which we know since the late 19th century from Svante Arrhenius, who was in Uppsala or Stockholm when he wrote his articles. So this is well known. And but what is also well known is the attempt by economists like Nicholas Stern and before him Nordhaus to see the increased greenhouse effect as an externality. Stern, in fact, in his report, wrote explicitly, it's the biggest externality, no? So the carbon cycle, the photosynthesis, the sun to start with, photosynthesis, the carbon cycle, the excessive amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the change in the temperature and so on, or the cooling of, or the change in the Gulf Stream perhaps, in Bergen, all this is called an externality. An externality. When, I mean, and sometimes I have also written that it seems to me that the externalities are more important than the internalities, no? But for economists are used to see markets and prices in microeconomics as the main issue, and from Balras onwards in analyzing this in different ways, and the rest are sort of afterthoughts from Pigou and so on, from the 20s, called the externalities, and economists, of which I am a lapsed economist, as I say sometimes, but I know this, I have taught this, kind of environmental economics. They think that one should internalize the externalities in some way, put prices or sort of credit markets of carbon dioxide emissions into the market. This is Stern, but Nordhaus was worse in a sense, from my point of view. Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize, or the so-called Nobel Prize, not in Norway, but in Sweden, isn't it? 3 or 4 years ago, he also started already very early in his career to talk about climate change, which was one, or not many economists were doing this. But then at the end of in his progress in research, in his researches about this, he, as you might know very well, he was reaching the political conclusions, or the policy conclusions, that there was not hurry in doing anything about climate change, or that we should not make a big effort of reduction, to summarize a long story, but a very important story. Because if we compare today's costs of reduction in money terms with the benefits of such reductions in the future, also in money terms, and if we discount the future benefits, as he said at the beginning, 6%, because this is what you would get as interest in real terms without inflation if you buy treasury bills or some kind of government paper in the financial market. So this is what the buyers of these papers were showing, that they undervalued the future at 6%. So they would not buy these papers unless an interest rate of 6% or 5% or 4%, doesn't matter, was paid. Therefore, the future benefits of today's reductions in the emissions of greenhouse gases would be undervalued at this rate. Why? Because it's not only what the financial market was showing as preferences of the investors, it's also that the future was assumed to be in normal macroeconomics even today, that there will be economic growth, isn't it? And economic growth also meant that the benefits for future humans, if they still existed, would be the marginal benefits, would be less because they were richer. If they were going to be richer, then they would have means of correcting the effects of the greenhouse effect. So you discount for these several kind of reasons, including perhaps what some economists call time preference, which is a metaphysical kind of, in my view, idea. Or perhaps it's not metaphysical. Perhaps you can ask people and they will show some, why this should be. So to summarize my critique of Nordhaus, which certainly is not original, is that it shows a little bit, one would say, the political arrogance of economists who think that not only that they are contributing to the discussion of the greenhouse effect, as mainly the chemists and the physicists have been doing already for 130 years, and now summarized in the IPCC reports, but also that they could have a kind of argument helping what we call the decision makers, or taking the role themselves of decision makers. This comes even earlier than Nordhaus, with somebody I knew quite well, and we were friends, David Pearce, in one of the first IPCC reports, when they compared the loss of human lives from climate change, and they put a money price on this according to the income per capita. So people from Bangladesh, who are at great risk from climate change, in some areas of Bangladesh, came up much cheaper than people from, say, New Jersey, where they are also at risk. This was then is how to value the externalities. If you value the externalities in the units of that economists use, whether it's money or utility, but just a single unit, you miss on other aspects, like human rights aspects, or things which are impossible to solve with economic reasoning. How we value the future needs for humans or other animals or other species and so on. And Nordhaus and Howard, many people have been criticizing this attempt to have an economics, a pure economic theory of climate change. Therefore, I think that, to come back to Nordhaus and Nobel Prizes, since I am here and not so far from where these things are decided, in the last 3 or 4 years, we have been proposing, some of us economists, or like myself, I already told the audience that I see myself as a kind of lapsed economist or second-rate economist. I am the Holbergpris is given for law, social sciences, humanities, isn't it, and theology. So I am also not very good in theology, but the question is that this issue of climate change is not from economics or even theology or the law, or no, is for all the sciences or many sciences, and also should be discussed from many points of view, and not the reduction to externalities. Now I'll mention something about Norway. About Norway, I don't know, already 15 years ago, I was once in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, with people from IRA and with Nimo Bassi, who was the person who in 1997, in the All Watch Network, introduced this idea and this slogan. He's a poet and he's also a writer, of leave oil in the soil. And in this trip in Nigeria, there were people from Friends of Nature Norway. 2 or 3 people came together with us. We were like ecotourists visiting the horror landscape of the delta of the Niger after 50 years of oil extraction with many victims. And these people from nice, I don't remember the names, I'm sorry, but it's called Natur and something in Norwegian, no? It's Friends of the Earth Norway. they were there and they talked to us about the Lofoten Islands. And he said, also in Norway, we have a slogan of leave oil or gas not in the soil, in the ocean, against this. And I have been following, in this case of the Lofoten Islands. It is in the Atlas of environmental conflicts. And I am pleased, as I understand it, that Norway decided, but it's the only case in the whole of Norway, isn't it? You have also decided to take oil and gas as the market demands, more or less, not even joining OPEC, for instance, to reduce it a little bit. And therefore, but in Norway, we have this opinion about, you had this discussion about leaving fossil fuels under the sea, and this has been a case which, well, it's an example for, I was very much involved in the Yasuni ITT proposal in Ecuador, which was failed at the end because President Correa boycotted it, in my view, and this is what. So to give another example from Norway, apart from the Lofoten Island, or the Fosen wind farms, isn't it, that somebody has already mentioned, and which is very interesting because the Supreme Court has decided something, I understand that after they have been built already, but has decided that it was invalid, but not using a cost-benefit analysis in money terms. The Supreme Court of Norway, with learned judges, as I have read part of the decision, does not appeal to a cost-benefit analysis in money terms at all. They talk about other values, relevant values, which are not commensurable. You cannot measure them in the same units as economic valuation, isn't it? So economic valuation is relevant, but it's not the most relevant criterion. So it's more like, in technical terms, what the Supreme Court has done for the Fosen wind decision is to do a multi-criteria evaluation, but not formalizing it. This is another Norwegian example of Norway outside Norway, because this is something that was in the subtitle of this talk. Norway outside, well, the gas or oil from the Lofoten Islands or from the Arctic that Norway is exporting, like the one that Russia is exporting, or Saudi Arabia is exporting, or Ecuador is exporting about 20 millions of oil per year. All this goes to plastics, perhaps to a little extent, but most of it is burned, isn't it? And being burned produces carbon dioxide. Therefore, the problem is a world problem. It's not a Norwegian problem or an Ecuador problem and so on. But the producers, so-called, or the extractors, the countries that extract the fossil fuels are responsible in a different way than the consumers of the fossil fuels, who are the places where this is burned eventually, isn't it? Or for instance, they take India. There are some regions extracting coal, and this coal doesn't leave the country. On the contrary, India is importing coal, and it goes to coal-fired power stations in the big cities, perhaps, or locally, perhaps. So you have both local impacts from the extraction, local impacts in case of coal from the particles and so on, and then, of course, global impacts because of the carbon dioxide. And the debates at local level, the fights, the struggles at local level, quite often, more and more, for instance, in India, as Bradoti Roy, who is here in the audience, has explained in writing several times, these conflicts, these debates, put together the local issues like the Lofoten, because it was Western fisheries and landscape, with the global issue. And the global issue reinforced the local issues, and the local issues reinforced the local situation, provided that the decision is to leave the fossil fuels on the ground. But further to this, there is the idea that this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere should be located in some place. And this is called carbon capture. And here I have just a little description from the Atlas, and I could have several from this company, Green Resources, which is Norwegian, at least in part. This is from some years ago already. In other countries in East Africa, in Tanzania, and I think in Kenya also, we have 4 or 5 cases, which I explain in the lecture in Bergen, which is available in the web, and the references are put there in the lecture in internet. So, well, this is, it has, I didn't write this summary myself, but it says, this has tremendous impact on local population because they cannot use this land which belongs to them. Of course, they get some money. As the trees are growing, they are forbidden to enter, but they get some money for this. I'm almost finished. And this is another example of Norway outside Norway, with the famous Norwegian company Norsk Hydro, which of course is old and is very clever kind of thing coming from the Birkeland idea process invented here of getting nitrogen from the air through electricity, isn't it? This was, I understand, how Norsk Hydro was founded many years ago. Now we see also, to talk of externalities, that the issue is not so much lack of nitrogen for fertilizers, that the issue is too much nitrogen on the fields, isn't it? And in the air from intensive farming, isn't it? As you know from this debate in the Netherlands recently, in which a peasant or farmer party was almost won the elections against the regulations of nitrogen excessive production, intensification of the nitrogen cycle. So this is in Barcarena. I know this place quite well, or relatively well, in Pará, in Brazil, where there has been, the summary is here from the others. Apart from this, there have been complaints, mixture of working class complaints and citizen complaints in this place. And there have been people killed, both, well, by the police, basically. Not many, but some, because of complaining, regular complaining against Norsk Hydro. And one could have other examples. The first time I met Norsk Hydro, sort of in person, was in India, in Odisha, where it was in Kashipur, also doing similar things as in Alu Norte. Alu means aluminium, no? Aluminium, so they take bauxite, they make aluminium, which is very useful for many things, including, well, you know, but with a lot of electricity. In the case of Pará in Brazil, is hydropower, no? So we have like green energy, in between commas, but producing damage. And the same thing in Odisha, we're explaining about also fights about bauxite mining in indigenous territories in Odisha, in India, in Kashipur, many years, 30 years ago, in which Norsk Hydro withdrew at the end, together with Alcan from Montreal, because of pressure here, no? Civil society, I don't know exactly who was complaining, but they ashamed them for what they were doing there. So these are two examples, only two examples, of Norway outside Norway. I don't want to say that Norway only does these kind of things in the world. Norway has done very good things in the world, in even explicit. No, I'm not just using irony. It's true that for the Palestine issue and for the war in Colombia and so on, Norwegian diplomacy, such a small country, no, 5 million. Even Catalonia has more inhabitants. Look how small you are in population. Nevertheless, you have been influential internationally. So, but this would be like a summary to open the discussion about, well, what are externalities, how we should not really use this, at least in teaching. We should tell the students this work has a history, but does not really solve the real issues. And don't be arrogant as economists, and before becoming economists, you should study the carbon cycle, you should study photosynthesis, you could study a little bit of geodiversity and biodiversity and so on. And then you can go and study the markets and prices, isn't it? And when you do macroeconomics, forget about growth and think about post-growth, at least in the rich countries, which I have no time to discuss here. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Then we turn to Kalle Mone, who has already been introduced, to give a comment to this, and then we will have a discussion and communication between the two, and also the audience will have a chance to intervene. But please, Kalle.
Yep. Thank you, and congratulations again with the prize. I put it on. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If I look nervous, I tell you why. I once were invited to Holberg to give a talk, and I thought it was just a seminar series for the Holbergpris, not that they had seminars between the prizes were issued and so on. But so I prepared for that, and it came, and then there was the Holberg Fund. It's an investment fund, and there were only shareholders sitting in the audience, and it was terrible, and it was a mistake. So I just advise for young people, read the invitation. But I think now we are home. We are in good shape. I'm in sympathy with a lot of things that you are saying. Most of you had time to say today was basically descriptive, and what I don't like is that I don't think you put the limit or the cleavage between enemies and friends at the right place. I think you could find much more friends among neoclassical economists, and I will give you some examples of that. But let us keep first to Norway. In Norwegians, they love to think about themselves as part of the solution to everything, but we are part of the problem. We are heavily into part of the problem of the world. And I think that is, it doesn't suck into to Norwegians, because Norwegians think about themselves, or ourselves. I'm one of them, and equally bad. We think of ourselves that we always do the right thing and it's morally right and so on. But I think we fail on many issues, also in the way we treat environmental issues. But not just think about the sort of the extraction of oil here, and how we have sort of kept it all for ourselves. During the Ukraine war, we had the extra income per year for 1 year of $100 billion. So that means 1,000 billion kroner. And Norwegians, we think about this as if it is ours. Many things could be sort of helped in the world if we sort of just thought about it. This isn't ours. It's a war profit, and we have to sort of invest it for the best of humans throughout. But just to have that debate in Norway is difficult. So I think I won't sort of expand more on this, but I think this is deep in when you live on rents from the nature as we do. We have a tremendous income from resource rents in Norway. Then after a while, you sort of your thinking becomes sort of blurred. That you become more egoistic. Actually, Adam Smith talked about these things in Wealth of Nations. He said that the landowners at his time, 250 years ago, they got their income so easily that they stopped thinking about it. So they can never govern their country, Adam Smith said, because they were so destroyed in their heads. They got so stupid because the ease of income, rentier income, as they obtained. They didn't understand. They didn't have to understand the world because they had this ownership of land. And I think Norway is in a sort of approach that stage. I'm sad to say, I guess I'm equally bad as all the others, but it's very difficult to have an honest, justice-based discussion of these things. Politicians don't want to touch it because they lose elections if they come up with it. But we we treat as ours a lot of things that doesn't belong to us, from any justice perspective. I think, and it's university had sort of unpopular discussions in downtown, and they tried to had somebody to oppose what I'm trying to say now, and nobody wanted to come. So I had the show alone. Okay. So let me say a little bit. I think justice and sustainability. I'm not quite sure whether you like these words in themselves, so sort of degrowth and sort of the rights of constraints from nature. I think all these things belong to a big debate about justice. That's my interpretation. It's a little, you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation. So I will just try to explore what I think about it, and hear whether we are talking the same language. I think that justice have a sort of a vertical dimension, and vertical is this right, and horizontal. So I think you take all the animals, all the foresters, all the people, and you line them up, and then you have it has a horizontal dimension, that you have something that happening within the generation, if you like, within a cohort of ages, and you have something that's happening over time. And so justice, that is in both directions. And I think very often people only talk about the sort of the vertical dimension of the justice, that it's over generation, as if within generation wasn't sort of equally interesting. And this goes for animals equally much as for and forest and whatever. So the justice concept should be that you should guarantee every group the same living conditions, broadly defined in my view, whether it's on this dimension, on the vertical dimension, and then I think however you measure this, we are so far from it that we can come. Both within countries and of course across countries, there's an enormous, and Norway here is of course obvious a part of the problem. So we're going to have negative growth in order to justify what we have done in the past. So other groups, countries, animals or whatever can sort of get something back. So that's my perception of justice. So that means that if we lose this horizontal dimension, I think then we are not talking honestly about the problem. We need both. And I think in Brundtland Commission, these things that she didn't use, or the Commission didn't use these words, but at least they were more along that track than most of the discussion is now. That we have sort of lost out this horizontal dimension, and it goes for the rights of whatever, defined by access to environmental resources more generally. It goes for everything, no matter how you sort of define. So let me I will comment on two more things. You mentioned discounting, and Nordhaus was. I agree to what you said. I think Nordhaus was he put way too much weight on the present generation. He wasn't interested at all in the horizontal dimension, but he put too much weight on the rights of the present generation. Then he had a competitor for the Nobel Prize, is Marty Weissman, who died recently, a Harvard professor. So he had a much better approach, and I think many people that I know, at least, I wouldn't. They sort of wanted him to win the Nobel Prize in he had fat tail econometrics, in a sense that he put more weight on possible catastrophes, that he had fatter tails in the end of the distribution of possible consequences of different types of behavior, and that have many implications for things that we are discussing here. And we can come back to some of that, but that perception that means that you have much lower discounting immediately when you have fat tails. That means that a catastrophe is more likely than it would have been without the fat tails. That said, let me just end a little bit by saying that I think economists are treated too much as an enemy. We have too much of a similar goal and things that we want to achieve. So I think this is, let me take one example. If you go 200 years back, it was typical for economists at that time, to think that land, which was a very important resource in these times, that wasn't private. You couldn't have private ownership to land. Let me mention, Condorcet had that, Turgot, these were central economists before the French Revolution. Adam Smith had these guys as his friend. He stayed in Paris and learned from them. Adam Smith was he thought that private property, he said, we have to remember that is very often to harm poor people and benefit rich people. So he was into at least he saw the two dimension of sort of privatization. When you go into into the 18th century, Jevons, a very neoclassical economist that most people would think on maybe a right-winger, he was for common ownership of land. That land, nature, God gave us the nature, and that had to be sort of politically decided, and nobody could have claimed. It was robbery to think about private ownership. Of course, Henry George, he inspired a lot, but he was part of a common perception of nature and resources at that time that seems to have disappeared later on. And so I think this is just to remind ourselves that we are stupid enough to become economists. That I think is useful, actually, and we can be inspired by this. Let me mention one last person. Walras, he was for nationalization of all land. And it wasn't only, it was more distributional concern. I think these guys, that you shouldn't, this was free income. People grabbed and destroyed the resources of that. So they thought of a different way. They introduced taxes that should, Henry George introduced a single tax that should finance all public activities. I think Walras was even more radical than Henry George. He is the founder of neoclassical general equilibrium theory. So it has some interest in the sort of. So why are these things sort of forgotten? I think because we discussed too little the history of things. And as I like very much the sort of the environmental perspective on history that you have. And that also, I want you to include more of good guys that I think can be easily mobilized. Norway did a good thing if you accept national justice, that justice have a sort of a local arena. Then Norway did well with the oil in the North Sea, in the sense that they could have sold it to the oil companies. They didn't. They sort of extracted it, taking 80% of the benefit. But many other things we did with these things were not super good. But here, I think, at least, if you accept the national justice, which I don't, but if you take that narrow view, I think the sort of treatment of the oil sector hasn't been that bad. I think I stop here. So just to sum up 3 points, I think there are more friends among economists than you like. I think the constraint that I think the degrowth literature and perception, I think that make really sense. I would have said more sort of green growth, or we use other words for it, sensible growth or things like this. Degrowth is just that you have sort of have the policy directly from the concept. So I think that should come out of the justice concepts and So sensible growth means that we can't continue as we have done, and for sure Norway can't continue. But in any political debate, ask Kristin. She has been a minister. She's been in 2 ministries. She's been a finance minister. Every election, if growth is low, that's the problem. It's will never be able to see that, of course, we are on the right track. Growth is coming down, but it's opposite.
Okay. Thank you. And both of you, Kalle, please, both of you here. You can go over there, and I'll stay. You can take a new glass over there. Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So thank you very much. I'll start by asking Joan to comment and give feedback, and then we will try to have some kind of communication and hopefully some time also to involve the audience. So a few minutes to comment back on Kalle's points, please.
To make many of you must have heard of Jason Hickel, who is a young man who is one of the leaders of this degrowth movement, which is intellectual and also becoming political. And he's coming here for some months or weeks, I think in October, because they gave him one of these Ernest chairs. So Jason Hickel, apart from being a young friend of mine, because he's now based in Barcelona, he might say what they say more eloquently and even more strongly. And so we invite him to come here, although he's going to speak often in other places. And then when you say that the Ukrainian war has increased the price of oil and therefore...
And gas in particular.
And gas, yeah. The gas that comes from Yaman. So the gas has increased the price. What effect has this had on Norwegian GDP?
Yeah, it's
going up, huh?
yeah, enormously.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So what we say is that GDP is, I was going to say it was a fiction, but it's not fiction, it's very real. If you have to pay external debt, like in Italy or in Spain, or if you have to put the money in a fund for future generations, which I don't know how are they going to enjoy life without oil and gas. But you don't take from the GDP the depletions. The depletion is counted as production. All the time when I'm in these debates, I say production of coal in India. I said, no, it's not production, it's extraction of coal, burning of coal, dissipation of the energies, second law of thermodynamics, and carbon dioxide. So why we call this production, isn't it? Or even in a more Marxist language, accumulation of capital, is dissipation of fossil fuels. So this would be not an objection to you as a person at all, of course, because economists have been discussing how to, and the GDP, of course, does not come from Barras and from the macroeconomics. It came from Keynesian, no? From Keynesian kind of policy. Well, the calculation of the GDP, as we know, you have William Petty and so on, but was done systematically and imposed on everybody by the World Bank around the world in the 40s and 50s. And now, of course, there are many meetings discussing what to do with GDP, or there are people like Amartya Sen or Martin Nussbaum, who was a Holbergpris, saying now we have to go for the index of how do you call this, Human Development Index, but it correlates per capita very much with GDP. So the economist is not the economist, it's, well, I don't know where it's the economist as people as, is the intellectual production in economics, which is linked to the industrial economy, and some people would say to capitalism, but I mean, I don't know what China is, whether capitalist or not, because the land is nationalized actually. But it's very, the fossil fuels, the industrial system is the same in 200 years ago, everywhere, more or less, with some variations like hydropower and so on. So instead of talking, in my view, about the theories of justice, whether roles applies intergenerational, all the things that you had in mind when you were talking, the fact is that in the States in the 80s, they started a movement which is the main influence on the others, called the environmental justice movement. And when we talk about this, I will say this is not from moral philosophy, this is from environmental sociology and political ecology. Because these people were saying pollution is put mostly in areas in the US in which black people live, or poor people live, or a mixture of black, poor, what we call now BIPOC, black, indigenous, people of color. And they did a lot of statistics to prove that pollution was tended to go, statistically speaking, more to these areas. And this was the birth of the environmental justice movement in the world, coming from the States. Sometimes, well, it's the only good thing, but a few things have come from baseball, and there's some other things have come from the US, and this is the best one, in my view, because it's influenced many people around the world. In a meeting that they had in 1991 in Washington, meeting of leaders of people of color and environmental justice, in which they said the principles of environmental justice are this, talking about the whales, the nature also, and indigenous people, the Samis, or the equivalent to the Samis around the Arctic, and the Arctic, and so on. So environmental justice is not just an issue. I don't know how they classify this in libraries. Should be a section for moral philosophy and another section for the environment. And why? In a way, going back to the question of externalities, these people were complaining against what we would call in economics externalities, but they call environmental racism. So these kind of words are important. And the whole debate since the 1980s or 70s, but 80s, also in this country, the Brundtland Commission had a great influence. Of course, I know it was not invented only by Mrs. Brundtland, and in Norway, for instance, the secretary was from India, I know him. And they were very proud to have invented sustainable development. And now sustainable development goals, in which if you criticize it, you are almost like a heretic, really, because everybody has to adopt this. But sustainable development, we said in ecological economics very early on that it was an oxymoron, meaning a contradiction, because you cannot have development, meaning economic growth, which in itself is another discussion whether development means GDP growth or not, but you cannot have this and this be sustainable. Or you mentioned green growth, for instance, or green. Well, when I say you cannot, I am not sure, and you are not sure. We are debating something, but what we observe is that social metabolism, the flows of energy and materials, are not decoupled from economic growth and the GDP. They go together. And now in Europe, in Western Europe, there is a certain, well, in Germany now, right now, the economy is not growing. Of course, the economy, the GDP growing economy, this makes it easier to degrow the energy and materials. So there is not the coupling one to one. And the last point that I want to make is about, I think I meant, or no, the Nobel Prizes. I think we have been, I didn't finish the phrase when I started this before, but we have been trying to nominating for the Nobel Prize in Economics, Bob Ayers. Bob Ayers is now 90-something, so we have to go fast, because in '69, with Adam and Nise, they published an article in the American Economic Review, which at the time really was more important than publishing in Science. Now, fortunately, is not the case. But anyway, in the American Economic Review, in which they said that if you look at the economy from a material point of view, you will look at the materials, not the energy. Everything that comes into the economy will come out as waste or will be recycled, perhaps. But looking at the accounts in terms of tons of materials of different kinds, well, this was stopped. No more economy, or very few economies, got into these debates on the metabolism. This has been done in Europe, as we know, but a group of people in Vienna, Marina Fischer-Kowalski, adopted by the UNED, adopted by the European accountancy system. This has not been the work of economists. And this was, of course, economists were busy doing other things. It's not blaming a whole profession, saying that the veterinary doctors have not been doing the metabolism, of course. Only we do the metabolism for some animals. But it's true that all this effort to look at the economy from a physical point of view of energy and materials, and also biological, the loss of biodiversity, has not been done by economists. We know this is a fact. But these things could be, in a way, at the level of publicity and images and professions and university jobs and new university structures, could be solved to some extent, and there was a recognition of, for instance, Popeyes. I'm talking about the old ones because all people are dead by now, like Georgescu Reagan, even Herman Daly is dead. I don't want to know the past for me, but I mean, I also met in a few years.
Okay.
But another man who should get this would be Baker Smith. Baker Smith, that is popular because Bill Gates is doing his books, has been working in a corner of Canada, in Manitoba, I don't know which place, maybe one colder than here, writing books about energy and the economy. He doesn't use the word economics, it's energy and society. And this has been done outside the profession of economics. And the profession of economics should recognize all this work done on the social metabolism, because this is the real economy.
Okay. Just before I let Kalle, I'm just trying to understand where are the similarities and where are the differences. I will try to kind of summarize a little bit. So Joan criticizes the concept of externality, but is very much also engaged in issues that has to do with justice today, in a sense. So from my perspective, he's also working, if I understand right, on the horizontal dimension. But the question for me is whether the concept of externalities is as a key concept of the way we as economists have learned this, can capture those justice dimensions, or if we need a different language to capture that. So that's one aspect. And I'm a bit confused because I thought on this issue you were in disagreement, but maybe the language is the difference. So that's one thing. The other thing is the question about degrowth or the metabolism. And I just also ask you, Kalle, how we as economists learn to think about this in price terms, and how much more we could actually describe the situation if we did it in material terms. So please, if you could respond to these two things.
I think the easiest way to connect it, if we can narrow a little bit down, so that there are many things here. So I think it comes from the concept of income. What is income? Because I think the basic concept of income, then you deduct all costs. It's value added when you deduct all the costs, including the damage that you do to including, of course, extracting wealth in one form and bring it up to cash. Like we take oil from the North Sea and we sell it and we get cash. That, of course, isn't growth. That is just taking wealth in one form and placing it into wealth in another form. And economics are quite clear on this, that, for example, in the definition of income, that is what you can consume, sort of keeping everything else intact, including the saving, the wealth that you have. Of course, if you use up the resources that you have, that isn't income, that is depletion of resources and not income. So here, I think, the mistake in economics is that have too few of the costs present in the calculations. And for example, when we discuss, we can only use the return on this sovereign wealth fund that we have. That is just because that is the definition of income. That is the return on the wealth, and so it doesn't come from. It comes from what is value added, and there we don't subtract enough cost at all. At all, I think it's a huge area of and here I think economics can learn enormously from the people that you mentioned. I don't know all that literature, of course, but I think I can hear immediately. National accounting was people worked very hard on national accounting systems in Norway in the 1930s. And they did in many Netherlands, Jan Tinbergen, where they were working. And they were very clear that this wasn't a measure of something good, or of welfare or anything. They were completely clear about this. For example, they didn't include the creation of values at home. They understood that there were environmental costs that they extracted from nature, that they destroy certain things. But they thought they should incorporate this later on. If they first established some of the basic concepts, it was the crisis, the world crisis, as you know, so they had to keep track of how of money and resources under the disposal of the state. So I think that was nobody, at least Ragnar Frisch, the main figure in the Norwegian concept, and Jan Tinbergen, they never talked about this as. So that came later. As a criteria of success, it wasn't there at all. And I think economists should be much more open to say this again and again. At least this could help a little bit that perspectives that you are advocating could come more to the forefront. Because we are calculated as income, things that aren't income, that we haven't subtracted the cost from it. And just to have that, so new measures of sort of the total creation of value, if you like. It's not words that I normally like so much, but it is, and I think modern society requires measurement. They would like to have measurement. They would like to know certain things. I'm too long, sorry.
But then, very quickly...
Yes, no. I mean, we like measurements, but in different units. And then the human brain is able to decide things.
But you have to compare certain things.
I joke that when one gets married, this is from the past, you don't look the other person only whether has money or not money. You look at many qualities and then you decide. If you wouldn't decide, you would never get married if you would perplex them out and insurability of the values. So that's humans do this quite normally, except that if you open today a newspaper or go to the web in Norway, you are probably going to find some remarks about the GDP growing and growing. And it's not only a thing that GDP forward to subtract, which we agree. We really totally this. I mean, if you were to how they were discussing how this book by somebody called Smelsa now, who says the history of how they decided to do the GDP. They did not act. It's not just forgetfulness, because we're thinking of the domestic, non-remunerated domestic work, as you would, or self-provision of agriculture and so on. But so the most important things in life, like taking care of people and eating and so on, they did not act. And the less important, which was living on the fossil fuels, they didn't say this should not be counted. They said this because the GDP is about money valuation. Things which are not money valuation don't go into the GDP. But you know, I mean, this calculated from the value added of all the companies and so on, and the value added does not. Companies do not never pay the environmental liabilities.
But I don't think you disagree on that, but I think you disagree maybe on what it means to calculate in one common term. And I see from your response, Kalle, that you feel this, or it discomforted, to put it that way, if you have to kind of do this in different terms, and there is no way you can say find the optimum.
No.
I mean, how much is it possible to argue to economists to say we should also think
you must talk to a different person than me. I'm not concerned at all with this, but there are many aspects that have dimensions that can't be reduced to a number. That's obvious. But it isn't enough to say that. You have to do, if you're going to look at political processes throughout the world, everything that has a number get weight. Things that doesn't have a number loses out. You can see it again and again, and so therefore, it is a challenge for everybody to provide certain things that they can see. Is there an improvement? Is it decline or is it rise in these things? To have more specific things, and we need more measure than just necessarily dollar or things like this. There are many aspects of life that is just like that, but you can. This is just the things that I care about, and I guess most people here. including Joan, care about are losing out because and that is the way people are discussing things. Simply that.
I think we're going to continue with this discussion.
Because I want to have the audience in, so
I was in one international
short.
organization called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, and the people running it all the time say, for instance, if you want to defend a mangrove forest anywhere on the tropic, you have to, one way is to count the carbon capture and put a money value, the biodiversity, a money value, I don't know how. But, and the defense of the coast by the mangrove, you say, how would you do this, not by a mangrove, but calling a Dutch company to make a wall or something like this. And so, with the argument, the way of convincing the ministers is to put a money value, because you go to the minister of the economy, not the, and you say, the mangroves are beautiful, the mangroves are marvelous, and so on. They are not going to be convinced, you put the money value. Well, in these meetings I said many times, this is an argument to change the minister.
Good.
You have to tell her she is one of them.
If they have to win elections, they have to talk to the people in different.
But also the Soviet Union talked about that we have to change the people. But I don't think it's. I never thought that was a good argument. I think you have to accept people the way they are, and people are demanding measures. At least unless you. But we both of us, I think, have a background in Marxian thinking. And there was a sort of use of time was one measure, labor theory of value, and that could be one alternative. I know that you were a student under Paul Baran, or at least colleague with him, and so he was he used measures on surpluses across. So there are many things that seems to be forgotten among young people, maybe because they were never told about these things where you can have inspirations. But I don't think we can change humans directly. You have to change humans gradually. I think that is important.
Certainly a huge question. But there are a couple of hands coming up in the audience, so I will try to, there were three. We'll just have those three, I think that's the only, and be short because time is running. So, Julia, please.
Thank you, Kalle, for talking about the importance of good friends and being a good friend and listening to good friends. But but what shall we do when our good friends are captured by the language of power? This demand for numbers to give visibility, but what if the meaning is lost when we end up with this number? So I think on the deeper level, you are asking for a new language. Well, it's difficult to change the language, but the language that can inform policy. I think you said something very important, Kalle. How can we as economists describe what is going better and what is going worse? How can we make this more prominent? Also to encourage politicians to not only look at strange numbers.
Okay, and then at the back, please maybe present yourself. My glasses are not good, so I'm not sure if I see who you are.
Well, thank you. My name is Ingrid Lomelde. Thank you both for a very interesting discussion. So you both mentioned the use of discount rates and how that means that we're overvaluing the present and not valuing the future so much. And I was just wondering if I understand it correctly, because most of us who are not economists don't really know that this is the way our economy works. But if I understand it correctly, it means that it will always be more profitable to cut down a forest today and reinvest the money instead of protecting the forest and its biodiversity services for society. But for private companies, maybe that's true, right? Private companies will always have more benefit from getting money today and then reinvest it. But for society as a whole, it shouldn't be true. It should be true that it's more profitable for us as a society to protect the forest and its services. So could you please help me understand more how we can how discount rates affect our economy and what the difference between private companies and public sector is when it comes to the use of value.
And finally, there was a hand somewhere in the middle. I think I only take the three, sorry. So I think you first. So.
Ja, takk for en interessant diskusjon. Jeg må ta det på norsk, dessverre. Er det ikke tid for en sammenfiltring mellom økonomi og økologi? Og jeg har arbeidet med spørsmålet i 50 år og lagt frem et forslag. Ja. Og Johan har fått mitt forslag, og Kalle Mone tror også kjenner til det. Hva om vi lager en internasjonal arbeidsgruppe for å få til en slik sammenfiltring, et nytt språk? Der kan vi bruke BNP, og vi kan bruke et økologisk, økonomisk samfunnsregnskap da, og filtre det sammen til en ny syntese. Er det et aktuelt eller interessant tema? Takk.
So let me translate. I mean, he argues that we should somehow kind of combine ecology and economics and create new languages beyond GDP. Even GDP could be involved. So proposal actually to have an international working group on this. Okay, so there were three questions.
He wrote in 1972, he wrote about this.
Yeah. You have been talking, but there are the question on languages also came up with Julia, and there was this issue of discount rate. So please, let's close by giving the floor to Joan and make your final comments on this session.
There is a key number that we all know that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is reaching 420 parts per million, and it's going to go up to 450 in the lifetime of the younger people here in less than 30 years, and then go up to 500 perhaps. So this is our numbers, and it's a very important number. So I could make the same sort of debating point again, which doesn't add anything to the discussion, and say the economists are not being taught about the killing curve still in the first month of university, which is true, and they should. But this is a very important number, so I also think that we must discuss with numbers. On forestry economics, we also would agree, because we have probably studied the same kind of forest economics. It's very interesting that in German, Nachtigkeit, must be similar perhaps in Norwegian, sustainability was introduced in the 18th century already in the context of forest economics, saying we cannot cut everything. It's better to wait until it's better economically to wait until the forest or the wood is growing, and there is like an optimum an optimum moment of cutting the forest, depending on the rate of discount, as you say, the rate of interest in the bank. Because if you cut the forest, you could put the money in the bank. It's a kind of Norwegian fund for future generations. And this is the orthodox economics of forestry even today. What was not so much discussed is that do you even make more money by cutting the forest in Amazonia, for instance, and putting cows there to pasture, or having uniform kind of trees. So plantations are not real forests, although in Nordic latitudes this is not so clear. But in more tropical world, if you cut the forest and you put eucalyptus plantations to absorb the carbon dioxide by calling these green resources or whatever, this is not a real forest anymore. This is a plantation of, could be sugarcane or anything else. So tree plantations are not forests is one of the slogans of the environmental movement around the world when talking about forest in the tropics at least. So this is different, that was not discussed in plantations of the same species.
Say anything on discount rate before I give Kalle, and he was been very eager to say something on this. But do you have anything to add to the discount rate, the private and the social, which was?
Yeah, no, this comes in real financial life from the fact that the banks give an interest rate because they think they're going to make money by investing. Where they invest in taking oil from the ground or they invest in other things doesn't matter very much. The bank will make money by, for instance, having a eucalyptus plantations and depleting the fertility and so on. This is in economic theory, a lot of this comes from Ramsey in 27, isn't it? Who discussing kind of Stalinist policy. He said, we could think that the future is going to improve a lot if we put all the money now or all the effort in investment for the future. And he discussed this, and he disapproved with this and said, why are we going to sacrifice the present generation for this radiant future, isn't it? This, well, Stalin was doing this, sacrificing in the 20s, 30s, to build tanks for the coming war, which is different. So I'm not criticizing on this standing, but there are a lot of reasons. But the Ramsey role was in the economic theory, calculating the optimal rate of investment, comparing present sacrifice and investment with the future benefit. And he discounted the future benefit because if not, you get a conclusion that the best thing is to invest everything now, no consumption or investment for this radiant future. This is the origin. Does not apply to environmental issues. Environmental issues are not discussing this. We're discussing that the future is going to be bad because of the pollution we are producing, to cut it short.
Different languages again, but Kalle, yes, you asked
one
for
sentence.
half a
I am
minute.
all for a change of language, or enriching the language in this area. I think the worst misuse of the language today is sort of commercial companies and made this sustainable development completely without content. Take the biggest, one of the best companies in Norway, Equinor. So they use this again and again and again for describing things that are not sustainable at all. And so I think these things have been destroyed already. So we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to have new words in order to communicate, both with Joan. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and with others. I have to say that I have to go now, and it's nothing to do with it. It's decided 100 years ago that I got to go to a meeting. Okay. So I can't go. I enjoy this a lot, and I would have liked to be. Thank you.
Okay, we are a few minutes behind the plan. We will have coffee and tea and some snacks outside. Be back here at 5 minutes past half hour or 35 minutes past 10. We'll start for the second session.
Once you can reach, it's very comfortable. When you speak very well.
Thanks.
Well, more or less.
You will also have a chance to come in the next session if you have any issues.
Det var den der, ja. En minnebrikke. Marianne, du har ikke tilfeldigvis på deg en minnebrikke, vel? Nei, det har du ikke. Da skal jeg løpe på. Jo, men jeg kan ikke bruke det. Eller så går jeg bare opp på kontoret.
Det er ikke det at økonomer er helt å fjerne, men de tas sjelden hensyn til. Det er enig. Vi har et apparat. Er ikke de også tatt vare på i det er ikke din greie, da. Men er ikke de også kan kunnskapsøkonomer, er ikke det viktig å få det på?
Nei, ikke sant. Jo, men ikke sant, der igjen er det jo veldig mye at man ser på det intensive jordbruket, og så ser man ikke nok på påvirkningen på naturen. Ja, og ja.
Du var inne på som det egentlig kan kalles stammespråk.
Ja,
akademisk språk, så er det et stammespråk. Men det må på en måte være sånn felles popular, eller være popular for at folk skal liksom diskutere. Det må være det. Og så den andre problemstillingen som Karl var inne på, altså i samfunnsøkonomi er det mye matematikk. Ja. Men noe av det første vi lærte om i matematikken var jo at det var kommensurable størrelser. Og så prøver vi å økonomene, og der går økonomene går og lik nesten av og til. For at det er ikke noe uenighet om at det finnes forskjellige typer størrelser, ikke sant? Noe er spiker, noe er tonn spiker, noe er for menneskelig, noe er CO2-utslipp og alt sånt noe.
Noe er kutt.
Ja. Og så er økonomene ofte svar på det, og det var jo i siste instans så forsøker vi å gjøre det sammenlignbart og bruke en form for verdi. En kroneverdi på det. På en eller annen måte. Og der er det ulike syn. Vi får spurt meg, er du villig til liksom å sette 8 kroner på en person fra Bangladesh og 1 million kroner fra USA? Jeg har sagt nei. Ikke faen. Ikke faen. Jeg har aldri gjort det. Jeg kommer aldri til å gjøre det. Men andre gjør det. Og det er ulike syn på det. Og det er også det er syn på det, hvor langt kan du pushe det, og hvordan skal du gjøre det. Det er også ulike syn på. Men stort sett har økonomer fordi at vi vil ha et svar, og det svaret på en måte må være i samme enhet. Det tar ikke mening. Du kan liksom ikke ta 8 epler og trekke 4 bananer og få 5 appelsiner. Det går ikke. Men på annen side så må du, når du skal ta en beslutning, så må du på en måte en gang forholde deg til at det er epler, og det er pærer, og det er bananer. Så på en måte så må du sammenligne på en eller annen måte før du tar en beslutning.
Han hadde et annet poeng også, at alt blir vurdert i kroner.
Ja.
Så
der pusher økonomen til det limit omtrent noen ganger.
Ja.
Uten at det nødvendigvis er grunnlag for det.
I en del cost-benefit-analyser så dukker opp noe som heter ikke prissatte konsekvenser.
Ja.
Og da er det rett i at prissatt lik nå. Nei.
Nei,
politisk. For i praksis så blir det også sånn på samfunnet. I praksis så kan det
Har du vært i London? Skal du?
Jeg har vært der. Det var veldig bra. 4, hva var det for noe? Det går fint. Skal jeg bare se hva som er på denne her. Har du USB-utgang, eller?
Ja.
Lykke til, Erik. Godt å se deg. Går det bra? Det går bra, vet du.
Da kan du,
Intens uke.
hvis du lager den sånn, du setter 04 foran.
Ok.
Det er bare noe med nummereringen, så jeg får det riktige rekkefølge.
Skal vi se.
Det var veldig sant. Jeg tok med et par til I tilfelle.
Skal vi se. Der er det først Ida Monica. Og så er det Må se på.
Vil den ikke?
Nei, kanskje jeg kopierer copy-paste I dokumentet.
Ja, du kan bare dra den over, ja.
Ja.
Men det livner inn en gang til. Så har vi jo den... Jeg ikke sikkert om det full.
Ja, jeg stryker. Så det jeg gjør at jeg sletter den.
Ja. Da den nærmere. Trenger du å gjøre noe? Du kan gjøre det med...
Kan jeg bare åpne, eller vi kan gjøre det der, kanskje?
Ja, jeg tar overføreren til den nå.
Ja,
Så åpner jeg den her.
at,
Ja, jeg kan gjøre det her. Når skal du begynne igjen?
Hei, Kristian. Hei, god dagen. Ja. Erik Gomes Barnetid.
La jeg en penn her? Jeg skjønner ikke hvor jeg gjør.
Gleder meg.
Og du snakker på katalansk også, eller er det...
Ja, litt. Altså, jeg var der I 4 år, så jeg vokste opp I Madrid.
Akkurat. Akkurat. Så du snakker spansk og
Ja.
katalansk.
Ja, eller katalansk forstår jeg kanskje.
Ja. Men nok til å icebreaking.
Ja da.
Det er bra. Strålende at du kunne komme.
Ja, kjempegøy.
Hvis du spør om...
Godt kjent med Joan.
Ja, ikke sant?
Skal vi se den... Ser det greit ut?
Ja.
Det flott. Da har vi den. Og så...
Altså, han hadde ikke sagt noe når du liksom du vil spørre. Hva var det du sa? At hun har rett hånda, men da fikk han ikke rett.
Med all åpen. Ja. Hei!
Jeg bare lurte på presenter review.
Ja.
Blir det på den store skjermen der, eller?
Nei, der blir det samme som på
Der
skjermen
det
der.
bare det samme?
Ja.
Ok.
Så det blir på den her. Skal vi se her, og du har jo lastet den inn. Ja, det fint.
Der, ja.
Så mulig, så du har den der, og så har du...
Ja, ikke sant? Jeg skal bare sjekke at, ja, jeg må ha litt nedskrift. Der, Nei, jeg gjør litt sånn her, ja. Så blir det bedre.
Du kan få låne min.
Får jeg plass.
Vi kan ha den felles. Ja, litt sånn...
Ja da. Klikk. Ja, ok.
Sånn.
Ja. Der ser jeg det I hvert fall her.
Mm.
Ja.
Ja.
Det fint det.
Trykker skate.
Sånn.
Kjempefint. Skal du ta bilde av programmet, sa du? Det den som står på Teamsen, da. Det samme. Sånn. etterpå. Og da vil jeg gjerne at du skaper den, for da kommer du ut på ordentlig, kjenner jeg det. Ja, du skal lese den ikke nå, men jo, du har den første, så kan du Marianne lese den.
Det er ikke noe lyd her nå. Hallo. Hallo, hallo, hallo.
Jeg tror det går inn nå.
Hallo, 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 hallo. 1, 2. Hei. Skal vi bare si at det er det vi har?
Det er det vi har. Så du bare stå foran dere.
Er du klar, Ida? Ja, flott. Welcome back. I hope it was, sunny and warm out there, because here it's a bit chilly. But we will survive, I'm sure. At this second section of the seminar, we will be challenged by presentations from researchers at CICERO and NMBU, 2 in sequence, and then we will open for comments and questions from the audience. First, Ida Sognes will present how fairness considerations implicit in models used to model future fossil energy extraction influence on their results. And Ida is a senior researcher at CICERO, focusing on the assumptions behind the IPCC emission scenarios and the use of emission scenarios by policymakers and private sector to inform decisions. She has a background in natural sciences and economics. So please, Ida, welcome.
Let's see. Yep. Okay, there we go. So thank you, Kristen. So I will talk about the modeling of future fossil energy extraction in the context of climate change and the Paris Climate Agreement. And I will focus on how the assumptions that are built into the models of cost effectiveness have implications for justice. So fossil energy from coal, oil, and gas, as you know, are by far the largest contributors to climate change. So fossil fuels account for more than 75% of greenhouse gas emission and almost 90% of CO2 emissions. And as climate science has shown robustly, every ton of CO2 essentially sticks around in the atmosphere and contributes to further temperature increase. And that means that in order to stop the increase in global mean temperatures, we have to stop emitting CO2 completely. In other words, we have to reach net zero emissions. And this figure here shows that there's a pretty much linear relationship between global warming since pre-industrial levels and cumulative CO2 emissions. And this gives rise to the concept of a carbon budget, which tells us how much more we can emit before we reach different temperatures. And these figures here show how much we have emitted historically in gray versus how much more we can emit if we want to reach different targets. And with current annual emissions, which are about 40 gigatons of CO2, if these were to stay constant, we would exhaust the 1.5 degree budget in just 9 years, the 1.7 degrees in 18 years, and the 2 degree budget in 30 years. So after years of dedicated efforts by scientists and citizens and politicians and policymakers, most people today agree that climate change is real and that we do need to stop emitting to stop global warming. But the key question, of course, remains as to exactly how we get from where we are today with a global economy that runs primarily on fossil fuels, to a world without CO2 emissions. So what will be the transformation pathway towards stabilization? How do we get from here to there? And this is a quote from the fifth IPCC assessment report. And in the IPCC reports and elsewhere, this question is largely answered by integrated assessment models, or IMs. And IMs are, in short, large computer models that combine economics with energy systems analysis and simple climate modeling, with the purpose of informing climate policy. And these models have become central tools in the IPCC reports, and increasingly recently also elsewhere, where they're used to show how we can reach the Paris Agreement target of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. So very briefly, the models use input assumptions on socioeconomic development, including GDP and population, technological change, political developments and climate policy, as well as internal model assumptions about how the economy interacts with the energy system, the land system, and the climate. And they use that to generate detailed pathways that show how the world can be transformed to reduce emissions in line with given carbon budgets. And the outputs of IMs are trajectories or pathways of a range of different variables, including different greenhouse gas emissions, energy use by different fuels in different sectors, the technologies that are used, the macroeconomic implications of the transformation, including, such as GDP impacts, as well as the carbon prices that are required in the models to drive the transformation. And most of these outputs are disaggregated by economic sectors and regions, which makes these models very large models. And I should just note that these IMs, although they have the same name, are different from the ones that were mentioned earlier today, which are the ones developed by Nordhaus, which are used for cost-benefit analysis, which are far more stylized. So this figure shows the pathways for CO2 emissions in all the scenarios that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees in the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which came out last year. And each one of these pathways or scenarios is generated by an IM. Now, each of these scenarios, again, correspond to a specific trajectory for coal and for oil and for gas, which together with a number of other variables, including renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, electrification, and so on, it's a long list, ensures that CO2 emissions are consistent with the pathways in the figure on the left, which again ensures that global warming stays below 1.5 degrees. And when it comes to the future of fossil energy, what this figure shows is that all the IPCC scenarios, in all the scenarios, coal goes down extremely fast and much faster than both oil and gas. Oil also goes down very fast compared to history, but significantly slower than coal. And gas is much more ambiguous, with some scenarios seeing an increase and some seeing a decline, but with the majority seeing a slow reduction over time. And based on these scenarios, the IPCC computes summary statistics for the amounts of fossil fuels consistent with the Paris Agreement. And the statements here, which are based on the scenarios, tell us that the global use of coal, oil, and gas in 2050 is projected to decline with median values of 95%, 60%, and 45% respectively. And this is taken from the Summary for Policymakers of the 6th Assessment Report. And these numbers are very influential. They're widely cited by international media, where they are often reproduced directly. They're used to inform climate negotiations and climate policy at both international and domestic levels. And they are increasingly also used as a basis to set targets and to inform strategies in the private sector, including energy companies and financial sector institutions, including banks, central banks, and different regulators. Which brings up the other question, which is how do the IAMs arrive at these fairly precise numbers for future fossil fuels, which are used to inform climate action among a variety of actors. In principle, you could stop using coal and gas for power first and give more of the remaining budget to oil, which is used more for transportation, or you could do it the other way around. You could also decide to use a lot of carbon capture and storage, CCS, and in that way make more space for fossil fuels to the extent possible. Or you could decide not to rely on CCS at all, given that it has not yet been proven at scale and that costs are still very high, which makes it a risky bet. Essentially what the IAMs do when they provide answers to how it can get from here to there is divide up the remaining carbon budget to different uses in different regions. And to do this, they need a criteria for allocating the budget. And this criteria, which the vast majority of IAMs are based on, is global cost effectiveness. And this means that the pathways for fossil fuels, for coal, oil, and gas that I showed earlier are the amounts that minimize the total global mitigation costs of achieving the given temperature targets. And this model design, like any model design, of course has particular consequences, of which I will mention just two today that are related to justice. So first, when the models minimize total global mitigation costs, they use discounting to make the future costs comparable with present costs. And because discounting makes it cheaper to pay for mitigation in the future than it is to pay for the same mitigation today, this pushes mitigation efforts into the future. And the higher the discount rate, the more uneven the distribution of mitigation efforts over time becomes. And this has, among other things, contributed to a large reliance on CCS and other carbon dioxide removal technologies in the IPCC emission scenarios. And in many of the scenarios, carbon dioxide removal is used heavily in the latter part of the century to remove emissions that are emitted in the former part of the century. Most IAMs use a discount rate of 5%, which is high compared to what is recommended as a normative choice in cost-benefit analysis. This, of course, places a greater burden on future generations. So essentially, if IAMs considered intergenerational equity more explicitly, and not just the present value of mitigation costs, the scenarios would rely less on future mitigation, and emissions would have to decline even faster in the near term. And the second example is, as I have already showed, the scenarios are more or less unanimous in that coal should be reduced much faster than both oil and gas. But as I said, the carbon budget could have been split differently between coal, oil, and gas. And the reason why IAMs reduce coal first is because it is the cheaper thing to do from a global cost perspective. But reducing coal, oil, and gas, of course, affects different people. And this figure shows the share of coal, oil, and gas in non-OECD countries over time. And it shows that about 80% of global coal use today is in non-OECD countries, in contrast to oil and gas, where the split is roughly half-half between OECD and non-OECD countries. So in other words, requiring that coal should be reduced first places a greater burden on non-OECD countries relative to OECD countries. In non-OECD countries, coal is, of course, a key source of energy and of development, and additionally, these countries have contributed far less to the climate problem, and they have a much more limited capacity to invest and finance the low-carbon transition. So there may be many good reasons to reduce coal dependence, also in developing countries, but the problem is that equity and development issues are not considered by the cost-effectiveness criteria that IAMs are based on. And while you could, in principle, impose them as external constraints or requirements on the modeling, this requires an effort and a departure from the default setup of the models, which means that it is rarely done. If IMs considered global equity, not just aggregate global costs, coal would most likely decline slower, and oil and gas would most likely decline faster. And this would affect richer nations, including Norway, relatively more. So in summary, the emission scenarios that are used to inform climate policy are based on models that primarily reduce emissions where and when it is cheapest to do so, but by using this criteria, they do not take into account the fact that the costs in different places and at different times is borne by different people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ida, for very important perspectives to the discussion of how to distribute the burdens or the cost in climate policy. And now I would welcome Monica Guillen-Royo, and she will present research on how we can live with less. She is a senior social scientist at CICERO, researching on sustainable consumption, human needs and happiness, with a background in applied economics, social policy and development studies. And like Joan, she is from Catalonia. Please, Monica.
Thank you, Kristin. I would like first to congratulate Joan Martinez-Alier on the Holbergpris award and express my gratitude to him for being an inspiration to many of us for such a long time. Thank you. Today, I will discuss the relationship between consumption and well-being, a topic that I have modestly contributed for a couple of decades now. And research on this subject is increasingly being used to support proposals, such as the growth or post-growth proposal. As you know, the growth or post-growth refers to the idea of reducing production and consumption in affluent nations, allowing for the allocation of energy and resources to low and middle-income countries. I will not delve into the necessity of downsizing affluent economies to ensure a sustainable planet. You can refer to Tim Jackson's work, for example, on the delusion of relying solely on technological advancement to achieve net zero emissions. But why focusing on well-being, as for example, Hickel in this quote says, implies consuming less? First, let's clarify the type of research that addresses consumption and well-being. Some empirical studies in this field utilize well-being indicators based on happiness, life satisfaction, or emotional states. Others employ indexes that incorporate indicators of educational attainment, access to food and healthcare, employment opportunities. The latter needs-based indexes are often favored in interdisciplinary environments, such as the post-growth environment. Here on this slide, you can see an example from a table in a paper by researchers, including Julia Steinberger, who is currently studying post-growth pathways together with two researchers at ICTA in Barcelona, with Joan. In their paper, they argue for the superiority of needs-based indicators over happiness indicators for use in climate studies. According to their argument, human needs theories can be used to justify the concept of satiation, meaning that when needs are adequately met, there is no further need to fulfill them, so we don't need to consume more. On the other hand, they argue that happiness indicators can be used to argue for adaptation, implying that individuals can adapt to living in an environment that is with higher temperatures caused by climate change, for example. However, the happiness literature has provided several arguments justifying the degrowth of affluent economies. And here are some key points that I think are important to have in mind. All the work of Richard Easterling is important to revise. Spanning from 1975 until the present, he has demonstrated that economic growth does not result in long-term increases in happiness or life satisfaction, a finding applicable to industrialized, developing, and transitional countries. Social psychologists, Tim Kasser, one of the most relevant, have shown repeatedly that the values promoted by capitalism are at odds with values such as community, affiliation, and self-acceptance. These latter values are not only conducive to happiness, but also support individuals' engagement in reduced consumption. Studies in happiness find no evidence that individuals who decide to consume less less meat, avoiding car ownership, reducing heating and cooling in their houses, flying less, are less happy than those who decide not to do it. In addition, Easterlin research indicates that while economic growth does not directly contribute to happiness, the safety nets provided by welfare states actually do so. So as I see it, this empirical study suggests that factors contributing to happiness align closely with the factors that support the satisfaction of human needs and might also support satiation or sufficiency. And it appears, and this is a very nice, interesting paper, that human needs could be satisfied at significant lower levels of consumption, emissions, and energy usage, according to a recent study. These researchers find that reducing global energy consumption to levels comparable to those in the 1960s by the year 2050 could actually meet the nutritional, shelter, hygiene, clothing, healthcare, mobility, and other needs of the global population. Additionally, the study suggests that non-fossil fuel energy sources have the potential to fulfill the energy requirements for decent living standards in 2050. And decent living, as you see here, includes, among other things, 50 liters of clean water per day per person, air temperatures around 20 degrees, computer access to ICT networks, so not really going back to live in caves. It's a classical argument that we hear. So, but how do we get there? How do we reach the situation characterized by lower levels of consumption and need fulfillment? Researchers in this field, and you see here many of the key ones, have suggested that in addition to investing in technological efficiency, this is never forgotten, this is something we need to implement eco-social policies articulated around shorter working weeks, basic income schemes, or universal basic services. There is a debate about that, progressive taxation, frequent flyer levies. Many of these measures contribute to both higher well-being and lower levels of consumption. But where to start? The work of late Chilean ecological economist Manfred Maxneff can provide some answers. His proposal for human-scale development encourages us to focus on systemic relationships, considering the interconnections, trade-offs, non-linearity, and path dependency between human needs and satisfiers. What he calls satisfiers are policies, institutions, technologies, environments, practices, and actions that either contribute or hinder the fulfillment of human needs. He also encourages to use a transdisciplinary perspective. Maxneff emphasizes the importance of being the whole in a systemic and holistic manner, where values and ethics are integrated with disciplines like physics and urban planning, for example. He has a very nice article on this in Ecological Economics, 2005, that you can revise if you are interested. He also, Manfred, encourages us to pair knowledge with understanding. He says we know a lot, but we understand little. According to Maxneff, true understanding can only be achieved when one becomes an active participant in the subject matter. This is why he advocates for participatory methods and personal involvement with grassroots initiatives to design and implement changes. I will conclude this presentation by providing an example of Maxneff's participatory perspective on human needs, drawing from my initial study, following his approach. It was the first time I actually used his approach. He provides with a methodology to work with groups. This study was conducted in 2009 with the participation of 47 residents from the city of Lleida in Catalonia. The findings of the study were published in the journal Ecological Economics in 2010. Through a series of workshops that focus on need, fulfillment, and satisfiers, participants identified several synergic satisfiers, or leverage points, that we can call them, that could contribute to lower consumption levels and optimal need fulfillment in the city. These included, among others, flexible and rational working hours, direct democracy structures, reestablishing connections with local farming, and simplicity values through education and individual change. As you see, this is a very rough thing, but I have attempted to represent a complex and evolving system where these potential leverage points are recognized and interconnected with many others. I obviously did not have funds to follow the implementation of any of these satisfiers or leverage points, and I obviously would not have been able to contribute much for lack of political influence. But things happened since 2009, particularly concerning two of the potential leverage points identified in the research. The first links to what you would call siesta time. Lleida is a medium-sized city where many families still utilize a 2-hour break in the middle of the day to have lunch together. This leads to a lot of stress, ill-being, and a lot of greenhouse gases from cars. Interesting, in 2017, a schedule reform was adopted by the Catalan government, aligning with the measures discussed by the workshop participants in 2009. Concerning direct democracy structures, these were discussed as necessary to increase citizens' involvement and meet several human needs. As you see here, The Guardian, this is a news from the Guardian, an article, connected the development of renewable energy cooperatives in Catalonia with the thriving of citizens' participation and engagement in Catalan municipalities. Both the scheduled reform and the promotion of direct democracy structures appear to be interconnected in my research. While the former seems to be progressing, the latter has faced setbacks. This setback can be attributed to the intense repression of the self-determination referendum organized by the same civil society that supports renewable energy cooperatives. So to wrap up, reduced consumption and high levels of well-being are theoretically and empirically possible. Happiness and needs-based studies converge on a wide array of policies to support individuals, communities, and societies in achieving the well-being dividend, which means reducing consumption but not losing out in terms of quality of life. A systemic and participatory perspective might be best suited to identify the leverage points that can have the most significant impact in reducing consumption and supporting high levels of quality of life. The only issue is that these leverage points might not always align with political correctness. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Monica and Ida. I think maybe you should join me here. And we will open up for some questions and comments. Ja, hvis du tar det bordet, Ida. Please, you first. Martin.
Yeah, I'm Hans Martin Seip, University of Oslo, and former also at CISRO. And when I worked at CISRO, I was known for always asking about uncertainties. And I have a comment to Ida's presentation. Of course, these carbon budgets are very uncertain. And a recent paper by James Hansen and co-workers indicates that they may be far too large because they estimated the climate sensitivity to be much higher than used by IPCC. And around 4 was a much more likely value than 3. And that would, of course, make the situation even more difficult than you have presented. I can't say how likely it is that they are right, but James Hansen has turned out to be right quite often.
Ida, feel free to comment.
Yeah, Ben should be here. Should be here to answer that question. But yes, he would be able to answer that question better than me. But yes, there are some uncertainties in terms of the remaining carbon budget.
Difficult to hear. It's not so long.
It is on, but
It's
yeah. Yes. So. There is uncertainties in the remaining carbon budget and the amounts. I'm not an expert on that. Ben Sanderson is in my group, but he's not here. So yes, that could indeed make it even harder to meet the targets. And the 1.5 degree target with the carbon budget that I showed is already extremely hard to meet. And there's a lot of people saying that we will not be able to meet it. But the findings and the sort of preference for reducing coal first in the models is, you can also see that in the 2 degree targets, which is relative to the 1.5 degree targets a lot easier to meet. Yeah.
Thank you. It just means that we have to speed up. Yes, please. Yeah.
Ja, jeg må igjen ta det på norsk. Veldig interessant det dere forteller om. Men i den modellen som jeg arbeider med, så snakker vi om framvekst. Det finnes noe, skal vi si, dynamisk skapende i mennesket, men så finnes det også noe konservativt som holder tilbake. Da. Og det må vi legge inn i disse nye modellene. Da. Så det jeg savner, det er en helhet, og en sånn helhet så kan vi få inn i et økologisk, økonomisk regnskap. Da. Så jeg ber innstendig alle om å åpne seg og se på det materialet. For all del. Jeg har holdt på med det i 50 år, og jeg er en samisk noaidi, så jeg gir meg ikke. Takk.
Thank you so much. He is still, you know, promoting his model where you emerge the ecology and economy, and I think we have to work on that, and the meeting places like this could help. So please.
Ellen de Wieb, not an economics person, but an architect. I wanted for the session that was before the break to ask Martinez-Alier about Kate Raworth, and now I saw in the last presentation there was a front page from her donut economy, and I would like to ask anybody who would like to answer, the two of you there or Martinez-Alier himself, does her economic theories have the right set of concepts and language for handling the different elements that we saw were lacking before the break?
So that was a question for you, Monica?
Yes, or for Joan, but
Yes.
in my opinion, yes. In my opinion, she has gotten, she has actually found the right language to communicate, and she's actually exporting this model of the donut economics all over the place. There are cities that are just adopting it, seeing how needs are satisfied within environmental limits, measuring which environmental limits each city and which in every dimension of the donut, which one have been surpassed, which ones not, what needs need more investment in. So, and doing all this in a participatory manner. Kate Raworth has also this systemic and holistic perspective. There's actually a chapter in her book addressing that. So I think she's the one that is coming closest to being able to have this sort of language that we can all use.
Yes, Joan, please.
Just very briefly, because what I mean of Kate, the donut thing, I don't know how it translates in all the languages, in Hindi or Chinese or in other places. In Catalan, for instance, would be buñol, which doesn't fit, because a buñol is something that anyway, has a different connotation. So sometimes you sacrifice preciseness for communication, no? Isn't it? So I don't know in Norwegian, if you teach students that do not economy the first day, perhaps they laugh or they like it, or they eat it up immediately. Anyway, that's not a joke, it's just we all are fighting for this communication thing. For instance, if you go, as I do, I'm going to teach you the entropy law, the whole class is discouraged, isn't it? If I say, I'm going to teach you the donut economy, perhaps, especially if they had not had breakfast, they would be more lively. But what I'm saying is that I have no solution about communication, these things.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
Thank you. Jesper, active in the climate activist environmental movement. About integrated assessment models, as I understand it, they don't account for methane, like Sir David King, who was a chief scientific advisor for the UK government for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, says that we're already in a negative carbon budget because they don't account for methane? So do you have does these models account for that or not? And if they don't, where are we on the budget?
Yes, Ida, should we just wait for the mic?
I think this is not working.
Yeah.
So they should account for methane. Or either the models, there's a range of different IAMs with different levels of complexity. Either they account for methane or the carbon budget that I showed, which I showed here was for CO2, has already taken into account some assumptions about the pathways for methane, which is part of the uncertainty of the carbon budget because it depends what you do with the other greenhouse gases. But if they don't take into account methane, then you have a problem because they definitely should, yeah.
Yeah, any other comments or yes, we have a comment here.
Thank you. I have a question for Monica, which is my colleague at Tech Center for some years ago. So in your presentation, you point to the fact that when you buy less, you can still be happy, like, you know. So I don't know if you come across the research, you know, target the other group that, you know, communicates sustainability and consumption to the group that continue, you know, buying a lot of stuff. So how research can, you know, target this group and, yeah.
Yeah, that is a
help them to buy less.
Yeah, that is a very difficult question. We did some research in groups using a Maxim's methodology, and where we invited people, we had screened people before by an index of materialism, how much they were attached to the material things. And we invited both groups, the ones who were very attached and the ones who were not that attached. And of the ones that scored high in materialism, nobody wanted to come to the workshops. So, you know what I mean? So this gives you like the idea that it's not that easy to reach. But on the other hand, when you put cycle lanes, even the materialistic guy who likes to drive will probably take the bike. So you don't need to have everybody on board to actually change things. And there are studies saying that with 33% of the population or the people in Oslo cycling, so you get most of the others also on board. So yes, one has to understand also how this works and differences in terms of values and differences and how to reach people or what is worth using your energies in doing. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions before we invite some new presentation? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Question for Monica. I just wondered if you could share some perspectives on how the experience with cooperatives, you know, as an economic model in a way, informs your thinking about this topic. Like, does it add something fundamental to the whole process of trying to consume less or be more sustainable or more conscious about how we produce and consume in our society, as opposed to, you know, more traditional, not traditional, but big business as we know it here in the rest of the world in a way. I know Catalonia has a lot of exciting history in that area, so I'm very curious about that. Thanks.
Yes, Catalonia and the Basque Country, they have a lot of tradition in cooperativism, but I haven't studied that, so I cannot say that much. I focus on the consumption side, so not that much on the production side. But of course, when scholars try to bring the consumption and the production side together, cooperatives are at the top, isn't it? Because it's like a much more democratic way of organizing production. But of course, they also want to sell. And so, yes, they are still in the system of selling more to make more profits. But of course, they work very differently, and they have the potential to be the forms of organization of the production system that would work very well with a degrowth and a post-growth thinking, in a way. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. During my term as Minister of Finance, we actually tried to develop a happiness GDP, or it was initiated by the Christian Democratic Party of Norway. It was really hard to find, numbers to show, so because that was their idea. But I think my grandmother's house was 100 square meters. My parents' house was 200 square meters. So should I live, in a house of 400 square meters? It makes no sense. So I'm back on 100 square meters. That's the only way I can find my husband. So we need to decouple the understanding of progress, because the understanding of progress is so deeply connected to growth. So that is maybe the main challenge. Thank you so much. Marianne?
Ja, så skrudde jeg på den? Er den på nå? Ja. So now we'll turn to the topic of nature in decision making, starting with a presentation by Erik Omé Bagetun. You're a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. You're also the president-elect of the International Society of Ecological Economists, and a lead author of the value assessment of IPBES. And Joan has already talked about the plural and often incommensurable values of nature. And these values have to be dealt with in decision making. And you'll give us your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks very much to the organizers. I'm honored to be here. Valuation conflicts in the green shift will be the topic of my talk. And I'll start referring to a well-known passage of a book written around 1845, called The German Ideology, where the philosopher Karl Marx reflects around the idea that one of the most outstanding features of capitalism is not only that it has managed to create, through technological development, productive forces with no comparison with any previous mode of production, but also that simultaneously the same process of technological development deploys destructive forces of commensurable magnitude, of comparable magnitude. To this reflection, we could add that one of the most powerful mechanisms of self-legitimation of capitalist economists has been to have developed accounting and valuation systems that systematically register the positive side of the production process, while it ignores or downplays the many hidden costs associated to the same process of development and growth. So actually, as we have known for decades, growth bears large unaccounted costs. Some of its expressions are biodiversity loss, climate change, resource depletion, and so on. So these costs very rarely appear in economic accounts unless claimed through court cases or unless state regulations mandate their internalization. So in practice, these costs are borne by third parties, future generations, poor communities, and other species. So the IPBES report, the values assessment of the IPBES report, makes very clear the idea that the causes of the global nature crisis are linked to the way we value nature in political and economic decisions. So how can we capture these hidden costs, these unaccounted costs of development and growth? Well, as Joan has explained already, the dominant approach among economists policymakers and so on, is this kind of framing of externalities. The idea that environmental problems, economists claim, stem from the failure of the market to internalize environmental costs and benefits in markets and price systems. No? And this is an idea that comes once and again since the STEM report, the TIB report, the Green Economy report, now the Dasgupta review. All this idea is always coming back. No? So what is the proposed solution? We should value these externalities in monetary terms and articulate it through markets, through different kinds of market mechanisms, no? Like offsetting mechanisms and so on. And how could we value this? Well, economists claim that we could use the so-called, we can do this with the so-called total economic value framework, which basically not only looks at the direct market value of nature, but it also looks at shadow markets, indirect markets, to capture economic values of nature that are not directly embedded in commodities. And when not even indirect markets exist, economists make up markets through these contingent valuation methodologies and so on, asking people how much would you like to pay for improvement in clean air, etc. No? This is done in the name of pragmatism, because then you get a very large number called total economic value, which you can compare to, that helps to compare shrimps, mangroves against shrimp farms, and so on. So the problem is, of course, this is often done with the best of the intentions. The problem is whether this aggregated number we get in the end, how much sense it makes. Because yes, these valuation exercises can be useful to capture certain types of values, but when we try to extend the measurement rod of money to other types of values, such as cultural values, symbolic values, sacred values, maybe we start getting numbers that are not entirely meaningful. If I may illustrate this with a cynical example, courtesy of Julia. If we want to settle in a new town, we may want to collect some information, like how many people live there, what is the level above the sea, or when it was established. But if we want to aggregate all those numbers in a kind of, add them up in a total information value, maybe we end up with a number that doesn't make much sense, no? So to this idea that it's better some number than no number, some people reply that it's better no number than a meaningless number. But ecological economists would rather say it's better to have several meaningful numbers than one single big meaningless number, no? And this is the basic idea of incommensurability that Joan Martinez-Alier has been spreading for decades, the idea that we need to deal with different metrics that need on their own different units, right? Some of these valuation languages can be quantified, such as material footprints, carbon footprints, etc. But there are others, like sacredness, symbolic values, culture, that render themselves better to qualification than quantification. And it is not true, and here I disagree with what Kalle said before, that we always need numbers to make decisions, no? I do not think the managers of Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim have, or so I hope, have to send reports every year of cost-benefit analysis to justify the existence of this cathedral, to convince policymakers not to dismantle it. Norwegian society apparently is ready to accept that this cathedral holds spiritual values, historical values, architectural values, and other kinds of non-economic values that justifies its existence, and we don't need to measure and make cost-benefit calculations. So how to measure the value of nature? When I ask my students what is the first word that comes to your mind when we talk about value, they usually respond money. And indeed, in the discourse of nature valuation, value is easily misread as merely denoting monetary value. But if we look, for instance, at the Dictionary of Oxford, we see that value has a much broader meaning in common language. It is actually defined as the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. So values are not only derived from preferences, but also from people's principles. And valuation is then about eliciting the way people attribute importance and meaning to nature. If we want to capture comprehensively these multiple ways in which people value nature, we need to rely on different valuation languages. So this idea is something that until recently it was like Joan and myself and a few other ecological economists preaching in the wilderness. But now things have been changing, and the IPBES report, which maybe by some kind of mistake, procedural mistake, has been actually been approved by 140 governments around the world, takes up this message from ecological economics and makes the case very clearly that the focus on market values, instrumental values, short-term profit, and economic growth has come at the expense of both nature, society, and future generations, and has often ignored the values of indigenous peoples and local communities. Politics, the report claims, has failed to capture the many ways nature is important to people. This other element that Joan already mentioned is this idea of framing these costs as accidental externalities or market failure was attacked some 70 years ago by William Capp, who opposed this portrayal of environmental problems as externalities to be internalized in the price system. Capp saw externalities not as accidental market failures, but as cost-shifting gains, through which powerful economic actors profit by shifting costs on others. Capacity to pollute or deplete nature at zero cost, Capp would claim, may not reflect a market value as much as a power asymmetry. The economic growth, powerful economic actors shift costs to the poor and indigenous, to future generations, and to other species. If Capp is right, this is very troubling, because it means that the profit margins, this idea we use very often to assess the success of economic companies and so on, may be commensurate with the amount of harm they are creating around the world. So again, going back to IPBES, it's also clear, the report on this point. It says valuation processes should be better tailored so the values of affected groups are safeguarded in the decision-making processes. The values that are prioritized and the methods that are chosen is partly determined by power relations in society. This affects which and whose values are recognized and how the advantages and disadvantages of decisions are distributed. So who carry the benefits and who carry the costs. So why is the green shift? This was the background of the point I'm trying to make. Why is the green shift causing so many environmental conflicts? Well, first we have to, part of the problem lays back in a report written 36 years ago, the Brundtland report, which as every negotiated document is contradictory and has very good things and very bad things, but it has something that has had very bad and long-lasting consequences for environmentalism, which was basically that after in the 1970s, the Club of Rome had convinced many political leaders around the world that perpetual economic growth in a finite planet was not feasible. Sustainable development restores the faith of growth, and just to extract one paragraph of the many where the report promotes growth ideology, the Commission's overall assessment, the report claims, is that international economy must speed up economic growth. Why? Because the Brundtland report predicts what we refer nowadays as green growth and decoupling. Again, extracting a passage from the report, it says, continued growth could be environmentally sustainable if industrialized nations can continue the recent shifts on the content of their growth towards less material and energy-intensive activities. So this idea that we can decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, from material footprints. The problem is that 36 years later, we keep waiting for Godot, and we see there is no decarbonization, there is no dematerialization going on in the economy. Actually, there is a rematerialization. Use of materials is growing faster than population growth and than economic growth. Why is this a problem for environmental conflicts? Well, at the core of the work that Joan and his collaborators have been doing at the Environmental Justice Atlas is this idea that the expansion of environmental conflicts around the world is structurally connected to the process of economic growth. Economic growth, there is no decoupling, so it involves increasing amounts of energy and materials. To feed this metabolism, we need to push extraction frontiers to ever new territories, and we encroach in the habitat of other species, in the livelihoods of indigenous communities, and so on. So environmental conflicts, the rate of the expansion of environmental conflicts around the world is structurally connected to the process of growth, which are two sides of the same coin. As the Environmental Justice Atlas has shown, this also applies to the many renewable energies, which are more difficult to criticize because they are green and so on. And we see that many of them are linked to this expansion of renewables. So what we see here is that environmental conflicts reflect also value conflicts. So when we have to decide whether or not we want to develop wind farms in a certain place, there's a number of criteria that, or valuation languages that come at play: economic values, growth and jobs, livelihood values, cultural values, natural values, recreational values, sacred values. And part of the problem, perhaps, is that governments put too much weight on the first of these valuation languages and systematically downplays the importance people attribute to many other valuation languages. So this is one of the big challenges we're facing, how we move into decision-making processes that can actually take due account and do a better balance of these different valuation languages. Part of the problem is also that some of these valuation languages have veto power. As Joan said in an interview in Klassekampen some weeks ago, if something is sacred, it cannot be compensated for with money. And I think one sentence that captured this whole dilemma is in a well-known passage from Immanuel Kant that says, "In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. What has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. What, on the other hand, is raised above all price and therefore admits no equivalent, has a dignity." But we don't need to go to the books of the big philosophers to find similar statements. We also find it in the lay knowledge of common people. A few weeks ago, I was in Nord-Troms interviewing Sami people about in areas of conflicts with wind farms, and I asked him, one of these reindeer herders, can financial compensation be part of the solution? His answer was, no. What to do with the money when the reindeer are gone? You cannot build nature out of money. But we also find these kind of reasonings even in kids. These girls are Sami people protesting about being excluded from the process of taking decisions on whether wind development should be developed in these areas. You may not appreciate it in the picture, but the lady on the right side has her dress reversed, which, as far as I have been told, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is a symbol of resistance and struggle in Sami culture. So I was interviewing these girls when I was there, and I raised the same question. I asked her, what if the local community received a large financial compensation for wind power development? So Ines, 14 years, told me it's not about the amount of money. Nature and money cannot be compared. And Alia, 15, told me there are many ways to create money, but we cannot create lost nature. Nature is irreplaceable. Very close to the statements of ecological economics, Immanuel Kant and others. I leave it here with the message that there is no green shift within the logic of growth. As long as we stay committed to the growth economy and to the dominance of markets and money as the hegemonic valuation languages, we will keep creating environmental conflicts, we will keep adding layers of environmental problems. If we want to have a green shift, we have to do at least two fundamental things. One is leaving growth behind, and yes, let's be clear, we're in the infancy of understanding how we have stable economies without growth, but I think Monica did a very good job at outlining some of the ideas in which we're working. The other one is that governments must take seriously the recommendation of IPBES and not take it only as a lip service, but actually start working on its radical implications, which is leaving behind the hegemony of markets and money to include a more diverse set of valuation languages in decision-making, where these other non-economic languages are not surrogates of monetary valuation, but actually are valuation languages on their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erik. We'll move on to Aril's presentation, and then we'll have a discussion after your presentation, Aril. So there are still some challenges left, Erik, and Aril, you will reflect upon ways to include these incommensurable values in decision making. Yeah, please, the floor is yours.
I mean, these are huge questions with facing all of us with issues that are hard to both understand and handle. I'm an economist. I've been an ecological and institutional economist, so I've always tried to straddle different strands. But I've been trying to figure out why do so little happen? And I will talk a little bit about that, and I will talk a little bit about how we could think about reorganizing decision making. So, as you have already been talking about, not only Joan, but all of us today, is now we have problems with making the necessary changes, right? So that's not an issue. We know that. And I figured out that we should, in that sense, focus on the way we make decisions. I think the fundamental issue certainly is about values, but it's how and which values then come into account. And one can simplify and say there are decisions to be made at very many different levels. I have focused on three: the economic decisions, the political decisions at national level, and also those at the international level. To simplify my story, I will focus on the second one, on the political decisions at national level, and try to see how we can change decision-making of political decisions to make the long-term count stronger. There is a huge debate, or at least a literature, on why do we ask and act short-term. And if you think about it, there are economic issues, but I focus now on the political ones. And the literature, in a sense, concentrates on four possible explanations for short-termism. Voters think short-term. Politicians are elected for short-term terms. There are special interests that come out of mainly economic interests that have payback in the short term as the main goal, and future generations are not represented. This seems to be huge and very difficult questions to handle. But I think still it's an issue about how we organize ourselves and what kind of mandates we give to different decision makers. So there is a hope or a possibility through institutional change to shift the game. And one of the things that interests me, and that's a comment to Kalle when he said we cannot change people. I, in a sense, agree to that, but people are different things. And we can change the conditions under which people act. And by changing those conditions, we can bring different sets of values forward. Observing, which is strong in the literature, the distinction between what we prioritize as consumers as opposed how we think and prioritize when we are citizens. So one could make a distinction between what can be called individual and social rationality. So why is this short-termism problematic? Maybe for you it seems extremely foolish even to ask the question. It's so obvious. But I think maybe I can add a few points to this from the way we think about environmental systems now and how lacking our institutional structures are to cope with the problems. From the kind of theory of ecosystem development, we have this issue of tipping points, right? That the system is quite stable and that it has quite some capacity to withstand change. Resilience, we call it. But when you come beyond a certain point, the system is actually tipping and you get a very different dynamics. And often, most situations will make it more difficult for the species that live in those surroundings before. And resilience is good, but it also is hiding what is happening. So it goes well, and then suddenly something happens. Then we have a structure of decision-making where we, in a sense, divide the decisions in two. First, we talk about economic development as if there would be no effect on the environment. That's been the process in the 1940s when it comes to economic policy. But as Joan has emphasized, the economic process is entropic. What comes in has to come out, but it takes time because the ecological systems are resilient. So this two-stage process of growing the economy and after making corrections is actually very dangerous, right? Given this situation. And moreover, this structure is creating power relations and interests linked to the status quo. Because we invested, and we need a payback, and we invested believing maybe that there will be no environmental harm. So when it comes, it's actually devalued, not only in the sense of using economic accounting principles we have been talking about, but also because the interests are there and will block politically any change. We have to get out of this situation. And one possible way to go is to deepen democracy and build institutional structures that can better handle the future. Certainly, this is a question not only about decision-making, but about what kind of future lives we will live. So in a sense, what it is about a new normal when it comes to how to live. And we have to create this. Monica certainly was discussing this. And this implies that we have to have a process bottom-up. But the process bottom-up have to have more power into the decision-making that is here. And it has to emphasize, I mean, this is a normative stand I take on certain values that has to be strengthened in this more long-term thinking. Long-termism in itself, justice, solidarity, responsibility, but also moderation. So these are values that almost all of them somewhat counter the present priorities in economic policies. So what do I mean by deepened democracy? Well, it's about participation, but also about a recent type of participation. That means deliberation. Today, participation is mainly on voting and on hearings, which are superfluous in a way. But if you want to get into a deeper and more fundamental change, we need to think about these issues in terms of participations where the citizens are able to more strongly express, learn, and evaluate arguments. So we talk about the process of dialogue, the process of deliberations. And there are many examples coming now of how these could be organized, like citizen juries, citizen assemblies, and so on, emphasizing the role of social rationality. So we emphasize fairness, that's equal possibility to participate, but also competence. And these processes need to have a dialogue, not only between citizens, but also between citizen and expertise. Why do I argue for this as a deepened democracy to be something that can help sustainability? Well, it has the capacity to strengthen long-term thinking. It's not necessarily happen. What we see from research is, yes, it will delegitimize egoism. So arguments for common solutions would be strengthened. But there are also indications from research that problem formulation and mandate that is, in a sense, developed or specified by the people involved, asked to represent the long term, is both something that we're able to do and that makes a difference. I have a simple case from my own research, or mainly the research of a PhD of mine called Katrine Sommer, where we tried to test some of these ideas about some years back. And we linked to a planning process at Nesodden municipality, just in the Oslo fjord here, for those who are not from Oslo. We were linking it to an existing process of land management area planning, focusing on the coastal areas. Remember, the coastal areas here have very high market value, extremely high market value, because people would like to live or have a cabin at the coast and are willing to pay a lot. So how do we maintain biodiversity there? How do we maintain common access to these grounds? So what we did was to invite participants. Actually, this is a test and it's small. We didn't have much money, but we had about 30 people engaged in 2 different groups. They were selected in a 2-stage process open invitation to a subset of the people living in Nesodden. 1,500 was chosen because of the budget we had for stamps. But people came back with interest, and we selected on the basis of some criteria that are general. You can see here gender, age, and so on. But we also excluded representatives of special interest. You couldn't be a leader or a board of a special organization, just to kind of make the role of the citizen more clean. So then we tried to discuss with them, how do we represent the future coastal zone in this municipality? And we asked them, if you would like to think about this as a basis from the community perspective, how long a time frame would you choose? And they chose, both groups, 100 years, which was shocking to us. We thought maybe 20, 30 years, but they did choose 100 years. And they argued why. Because they saw the difference between their present interests and their future interests were in conflict, and they wanted to take side in that. They were informed by and had dialogue with experts, and they had dialogue between themselves, and there was, they developed a proposal for the municipal board. I don't have time to go into details. One thing is that they, against many of the people, explicitly said, I have a private interest in building in this area. But here, as a citizen, I take a different view. And the one who was actually asked to present this for the municipal planning committee said, I shouldn't do it because I have a building proposal in the community, so I will not be seen as legitimate. A female who wasn't at the first meeting came in and argued very strongly for her personal interests. And the others, they reacted very strongly to her because she didn't follow the rules, because she didn't know the rules. So what I try to illustrate by this is that there are potential in those different types of institutional structures. And on basis of that, I made a couple of proposals for how we can make our political decisions more long-term. First of all, there is a huge literature on this, which proposes a lot of different ways we could go about, and I would advise you to link into it. There are some experiences. I don't have time to go through any of them. That's not my main point. But what I see is a tendency when those deliberative types of systems where people participate, when these or there are others who get these kind of roles to kind of protect the future, if it starts biting politically, hands get cut off. So there is something to change culture, but also change the power of these. I have two proposals, and I will close very briefly by those. One is to institutionalize, like say in a country like Norway, deliberative citizen assemblies that could be called citizen assemblies for sustainability, both to any municipal board and to the parliament. And give them the mandate to focus on long-term sustainability and evaluate proposals in these decision-making bodies and come with reactions to those and select them in ways, could be like we did in the Nesodden case. The point is to give them suspensive power so that they can stop the process, arguing that this is not sustainable, ask for a debate within the community, ask the municipal boards to defend their position, but also be open for changes. And in the end, they have to argue for why they stayed with their original proposal or made a change. This will open up for a public debate, which I think is so necessary. One could go further and not only think about these as they have not the decision power, they could only propose. But you could also go further and think about, yeah, that was what I already said. You could also think about a second house in the parliament, which is a house for sustainability. Again, having this kind of mandate of thinking about the future, but giving them veto power. Because now you can legitimately do that because they're elected, right? And they can then stop decisions in the ordinary, in our case, Storting, to change their decisions, and if they're not long-term. Certainly, these are huge issues and very difficult, and many things to discuss about how we could and should do it. But I think it still is the main issue here is how to strengthen the future through strengthening the public engagement that will follow from these kind of structures, I believe. So, closing. Yes, a sustainable society demands changed institutions which can empower the future through the present by changing mandates and changing powers. Certainly, I focused only on political decision-making, but the idea is that by strengthening the political process in this way, we can change the rules for economic decision-making, because, yes, economics is an entropic system. The point being that the key changes has to happen at the economic level, but that is a different talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we open up for questions and comments from you in the audience. Any? Yeah.
Joan Martinez-Alier again. I have one question to the last speaker. One thing is that we need to do something very, very quickly. As Guterres said that when the last IPCC summary report was presented, he said that he quoted from the title of the film that won the Oscar, that we need to do everything, everywhere, all at once. And do you think your suggestions will really speed up the process sufficiently?
Yes.
Yeah, no, certainly this is a huge issue. I think, yes, the first proposal can be instituted quite quickly. The second one is certainly much more for a longer term. But the point being that we, as you also observed, we are sitting there doing nothing, almost nothing. And I think we should, this should have been done in 1980, right? We have enough information to do it, but it hasn't happened. And I am afraid that we are in a situation where if we believe we can do shortcuts here and believe that politicians on their own are able to act, I think we are doing ourselves a disfavor. But I understand that this will take time, but if we don't go into it, I think we cannot solve the problem, even though we have to suffer some time in between before we get to establish these systems.
Thank you. And,
Ja, veldig bra av dere begge. Jeg er jo en gammel aktivist. Jeg var leder for den siste sultestreiken for samene i 1981. Og da la jeg fram disse nye tankene da. De ble jo selvfølgelig ikke hørt den gang. Det må skje noe raskt, ja, jeg holder med. Og det interessante er at et økologisk perspektiv kan umiddelbart løse de økonomiske spørsmålene. Så det henger helt nøye sammen. Det er en adrianetråd. Man drar i den adrianetråden da, så løser seg alt. Så den adrianetråden må vi trekke i, og den finnes faktisk i økologisk økonomi. Enten man vil tro det eller ikke. Det er kanskje for godt for å være sant, men det er sant.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you, it's the same argument. We need to combine the ecological models with the economic models. Yeah, you have any comments on this?
I
Again?
agree.
Yeah. Julia, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, Julia Aslaksen from Statistics Norway. Erik, you talked about the power asymmetry, and it would be interesting if you reflect on also this regards the climate policy that also allows the development of the wind power, and the power asymmetries here and the lack of overarching thinking and so on. But also you said the importance of developing the meaningful numbers. So how could we do that to show the loss of nature? You know, the large loss of the landscape values, not only looking at the biodiversity hotspots. And yeah.
So, for instance, Norway has developed this Norwegian Nature Index, no? Which is a composite index to look at loss of nature and loss of nature quality. No? So if this idea of IP best that government should balance different values and so on is taken up seriously, ministers and presidents and decision makers will have to sit down and take GDP on the one hand, and then the Norwegian Nature Index on the other hand, and maybe other kind of composite indicators for cultural values on the other hand, and deliberate around this idea. So I think these tools to measure, quantify, qualify these different values already exist. It's just that within the institutional frame in which we operate and within the existing power structures, they are not being applied, or they are not giving enough weight to balance with economic considerations. So I guess it's more this process of value change, of cultural change, than actually having the technical means to do so, which I think we pretty much have.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Tormod Knudsen, happy amateur philosopher. 50 years ago, when the Ministry of Environment was established, some of us meant that it had to be located on a level above the Ministry of Finance. I think that would have made the problems a little bit less. Thank you.
Yeah. Arild would like to comment.
It's interesting, at that time there was also a discussion about two different languages, right? Because the Minister of Finance had its kind of budgeting language, and the Minister of Environment wanted to have a different kind of an alternative to the GDP that was based on area use, and also wanted to have power on the use of land to an extent that they have actually lost more and more. So for sure this is, but I think it illustrates the same thing, that we haven't really understood the anthropic characteristic of the economy. So I think it's just now that we start realizing that these environmental costs are so much higher than even maybe the economic gains of many of the projects that we have. So we are in a situation where it turns. But that is not only about a decision between ministries, right? Because it has very much to do with what motivates economic activity, both when it comes to consumers, but also when it comes to producers, an issue that was raised. Why do we invest? For what reason? Do we invest for quick paybacks, or do we invest for the future? That is, to me, the key issue.
I think we will round off now, and I'm very happy we managed to stick with the timetable. You're about to fetch a ferry and leave Norway, Joan. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to you as well, and Monica and Ida, and all of you contributing. I'll leave the last words to you, Bjørn, please.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and I can assure you that I'm not from the Holberg, fund. I'm from the Holbergpris. I'm its academic director. I know that Kalle Mone has left, but I wanted to reassure the rest of you. When given this slot to say concluding remarks at like 2 to 12, I was thinking about the doomsday clock, you know the one organized by scientists to impel human beings across the world to work against various forms of, well, doom. However, after having heard the discussion today, I feel a bit more uplifted. I've heard possibilities of deepening democracy and collaboration and collectivity kind of experiments. I've heard that it's possible to be happy with less. And I've heard also at least the start of a conversation between different disciplines to rethink economy and broaden its field, also to include a pluralization of values, something I, as an anthropologist, of course, also deeply value. So to me, this means that if the clock has not been moved backwards, that is the doomsday clock, at least there have been presented here today ideas that I think are somewhat uplifting. And this is no small feat in itself on a Monday morning, I would say. Also, on behalf of the Holbergpris, which is 20 years this year, I would like to express that it's been very stimulating to organize this event with Cicero and NMBU. It is the last event we have in the Holberg Week and the second event we have in Oslo. And although I would have liked to expand on a number of issues, I will have to be brief. This is also, as our guest of honor, Professor Joan Martinez-Alier, has a schedule that resembles a just-in-time production system, which is a system of production I think he loathes, and I think we have very many who are critical of that, but it is in a sense that that is the fate he has now, because he has, as Marianne said, a boat to catch. So finally, I would like to thank everyone who's been here on stage, contributing to moving the dial of this clock a bit backwards. I would also have to thank especially Marianne Aasen for taking this initiative. This was very welcome. We like to partner with other sciences, disciplines, and research communities in the Holbergpris. And I would like to thank you for all your effort and work having gone into this. And I would like to thank, lastly, the audience who have shown up here today and those that might still watch this later on. So thank you all, and safe travels, Joan.